Hello, I'm Doug Bamford, and I'm a lecturer of lifelong learning at the University of Oxford. My reason for making this video is because there seems to be a lot of sort of talk about net zero being really, really expensive. And so I thought I'd have a video on this question, can you afford net zero? And I suppose you can look at this in lots of different ways. So we'll go through those. And yeah, in terms of affording it, what might that mean? And I guess to start with, you have to say, well, achieving net zero compared to what? What's the alternative situation? Because I think this is where people have very different things in mind. So, for some people, the alternative to net zero is just doing nothing, like doing nothing about climate change, just pretend it's not happening. And so maybe that's like not zero. That's just we carry on polluting, and that's an option, of course. That's what we were doing for a very long time before we really were sure about climate change. Then, no one even questioned it. But then gradually people became more and more aware of this issue. People learned about climate science and what the scientists were saying and so on since the 1980s. So then, some people say, well, we should still do nothing for whatever reason, and other people say, no, we should do something. But if you do nothing, basically climate change is just going to keep getting worse. And essentially, we're just passing on the costs to future generations. Not even future generations, people who are kids now are going to have to pay to deal with all of this stuff. So that's the alternative that I think people have in mind. And let's not forget that that is something that is creating huge costs. The people of the future are going to have to, pay back all our debts, but also they're going to have to also pay for the costs of dealing with the impacts of climate change. And they're probably going to have to suck some of the pollution out of the air that we're putting up there at the moment as well. So that's something that they're going to be left with. So lucky them. That's the way things are going. And so the suggestion is, well, if we at least get to net zero, we won't be making anything worse for the future generations. They'll just, have things as they are now. So then what might it mean to talk about the costs of net zero? What are these costs? And there's lots of different kinds of costs that people might be thinking of. So one of them is the fact that we need new infrastructure. We need to have a load of new kind of cleaner technology to replace the polluting things that we do at the moment. So, yeah, very obvious example, we get rid of the coal-fired power plants and we put in gas-fired power plants. That's what we were doing 20 years ago because they're much less polluting than the coal is. And then you start to install solar panels so that you don't need to burn gas when the sun is shining. And then you put in wind turbines so that you don't need to burn gas when the wind is blowing. And you connect all this stuff up. So that's something that you can do to reduce your carbon emissions for electricity. And as time goes on, those coal plants were getting older, they need to be replaced. So the question is, do you replace them with another coal plant or do you replace them with cleaner things? So you're going to be paying for some infrastructure. Gradually over time, you replace the dirty infrastructure with the cleaner infrastructure. And in some cases, actually, it's just a no-brainer. Solar power has become really cheap, so why would you want to put in anything more expensive? And then there's other cases where the new infrastructure might have a bit of extra cost up front, but it will be much cheaper over the lifetime of the that's very often the case, actually. With we think about, the cleaner products, they might cost a bit more, like a heat pump costs a bit more than a gas boiler. Maybe an even better example is an EV, right? Because they cost a lot less to run. If you can charge it at home, then it's going to save you loads of money over the course of several years as the price of the different types of vehicle have become more similar. And in some cases now, it's the same price to buy an EV versus the petrol powered version of a car. And maybe even for some people, it might be that the less polluting option is more expensive to buy and it costs the same to run it. So maybe for some people that could be the case for an EV if you can't charge it at home or something, or maybe a heat pump if you, I don't know, for some people it might work out more expensive. Maybe if your house is very leaky or something like that, then you can't do anything about that. So it's possible that that's the case. But generally speaking, when you're replacing something, you replace it with a cleaner one. When you're replacing a gas boiler, you put in a heat pump, and so on and so on. It's an expense you were going to have, and you just have a slightly different choice at that point in time. The other cost that you might think of is, well, what about if you just do the pollution and then you pay someone to clean up after you, essentially? So obviously, you're going to do always the cheaper options first when you're thinking about these things. And so maybe the cheapest option is, you do a bit of pollution and then you pay someone to install a solar panel somewhere else. And then that uses, that generate less carbon than the thing is replaced. And so you're going to do these cheap things first, right? That's the obvious thing. If you can, plant some trees somewhere that are going to absorb some carbon, and that's pretty cheap, then, do that. But eventually you're going to run out of the cheap options. And eventually, in the future, we'll get to the point where the only kind of sort of option to clean things up is just to suck the carbon out of the atmosphere and then bury it under the ground. So put it back in the places where we got the oil out of and the gas out of. There was a methane under there, and now we force carbon dioxide into the places where the methane was. We hope that that will stay there like the methane did. It wasn't cheap to get the methane out. It'll be even more expensive to put, something else underneath where that was. So that's not going to be cheap at all. That's going to be really expensive. It's going to take loads of energy. And so, yeah, so that's going to cost a lot to run these big machines, suck out the carbon from the atmosphere. Better to keep the carbon under the ground in the first place, you might think. There we go. That's where we're going to get to over time. And for some things, that might be the only option. So, yeah, so this is the future. What are the net zero costs then? We can think about it in terms of what's the cost to the government? So there's cost to the government if they're subsidizing this kind of transition from dirty to cleaner electricity. And maybe the government will have to invest in new infrastructure as well. If it needs to put in new pylons, maybe, they might pay for that to transport the electricity around from different places than it used to go from and to before. So new big scale electricity infrastructure is one obvious option for this. And they might make all sorts of other investments as well to make this transition go more smoothly. There's also the costs to individuals, right? If I'm going to be buying and installing new technologies, then that's something that I have to pay for. Now, obviously, it's a bit like what I was talking about before. If I'm replacing my gas boiler, I replace it with a heat pump. We've just done that. So, you would have had to pay for something anyway, and you just do something different instead. But there are costs to the individuals if you're doing that. But obviously, also, if the government starts to say, well, we're going to start to charge you for the cost of your pollution, which they do for some things, but not everything. And so, if that was made more consistent, then obviously people would have to pay more for the polluting activities that they do. So this gets us onto this idea of carbon pricing. So different people have different ideas about the best way to respond to climate change. And if you think about like a mainstream economist, they're going to say, look, the best, most efficient thing to do is you put a price on carbon. So carbon is causing these social problems through the pollution, through the, you know, all the processes that are going on in the atmosphere, and then the way that affects all sorts of other things that then, affect the food that's grown and affect, the weather and the damage that's done by, storms, all these different things. That's imposing cost on future people. And so we just increase the cost of the pollution to discourage people from doing that. And so, for example, a carbon tax is the most direct way of doing that. And that's what economists mostly are going to argue for. So then you have to do some complicated calculation, which everyone's going to disagree on, about what the value of the harm is of climate change, and then add that to the price of products. I think that these calculations, the way they're done, they're far too low. They're not really taking into account the harm as much as they should. But people are doing these calculations, trying to work these things out. It's better to have some price than no price at all, I suppose. And then once you've worked that out, you start to impose that social cost of carbon through carbon tax is one way, but there's lots of other ways you could do. And however you're imposing this cost, the idea is that it's the polluter that pays. And as I was saying before, if the polluter isn't paying for pollution, then it's the polluted that pays. It's the future generations in this instance, depending on the kind of pollution. In this case, it's changing the climate, which is making life harder for future generations. And so, this idea of a carbon tax, this is something that even the sort of, I'll call them free market think tanks, but George Monbiot calls them neoliberal junk tanks. For example, just to pick one, like, so sorry, Adam Smith Institute, but I've seen that they've advocated for a carbon tax. So, they're not denying climate change. They're saying this is a problem, and the way to solve it is to put a price on carbon, use a carbon tax, and maybe some people would say, well, it'd be better to do other things, regulate and force people to buy certain technologies or, industries to change their ways or something like that. Maybe people on the left might want more government, stronger intervention of that kind. But the right wing alternative is just to impose this kind of carbon tax to fully kind of acknowledge that social cost of carbon. And so that's a sensible option, I think, to do that. Let's agree on that. And then, going back to that point I made earlier, this social cost of carbon is almost certain to rise over time. There might be exceptions to that. Maybe the cost of solar panels going down has actually reduced the costs of responding to climate change because it isn't as expensive as we thought it was going to be. The reduction in the cost of batteries as well, it really helps this process, right? So might not always go up as much as we think it will. Maybe some new technology will mean it will be cheaper than we think it is at the moment. But the idea of the social cost of carbon is that you are going to decarbonize in the most efficient way. Because what you're going to do is, if you're a company and you're going to be charged this social cost of carbon, then obviously if there's something really easy you can do to reduce your carbon footprint, then you're going to do that. So you'll do the cheapest thing first, the easiest option. What might be called the low-hanging fruit is the thing that's going to be prioritized if you just impose a carbon tax. Because why would you do the more expensive thing, right? You're just going to do, if there's something that actually is going to save you money, it works out cheaper once you put on this carbon tax, then you're just going to do that. You won't do the harder things. So when people say, oh, why are we decarbonizing cars when, mines are really polluting or something like that, and that's where the bits come from to make the car, well, maybe it's just a lot cheaper to decarbonize a car that, is in an urban environment where you can plug it in than a mine in the middle of nowhere with no electricity supplies that can give it clean electricity or something like that. Some mines might be able to have, like in Australia, they could have loads of solar panels there and actually be a very clean mine, but in other places, that might not be possible. And so, or it might be really, really expensive. So you do the cheapest thing first. That's the basic idea of this, is you start with the easiest stuff. And number one is almost certainly going to be solar power, right? It's the cheapest form of electricity at the moment. And electrification generally is another thing you can do. So the fact that batteries have come down so much because of all of the electronics and then the cars that we're making, that's made companies get better and better at making batteries, coming up with new batteries and all that sort of thing. And we're at the point now where an electric vehicle in most countries, it's just the obvious choice, right? It's much cheaper to own and run an electric vehicle. I've got one, they're much better to drive, they're just much nicer to experience generally. So, people are going to do this. They're going to do it for economic reasons. They're going to go for this option if they can charge it at home, especially. Then it's just the better option. But as I say, there's some things that are going to be a bit harder to do. Like maybe if you've got a mine in the middle of nowhere, it's quite hard to decarbonize that or something like that. I mean, maybe that means we should do more mining in the places where it's easiest to decarbonize. So maybe mines in different places. If you start to charge the social cost of carbon to things, people might make those kinds of decisions. But if you've already got the mine, you probably keep it running and pay the fee, pay the cost for the carbon tax or whatever it is that you're doing. There's some things that are very hard to decarbonize. So meat is an obvious one. Cows produce huge amount of methane. Methane is really potent greenhouse gas, much, much stronger than CO2. And cows just belch this stuff out. They eat tons of grass, and then, they kind of, it's very hard to digest grass. Humans don't eat grass, right? Because it's so hard to digest it, but animals, well, cows can anyway, but in the process of that, they produce loads and loads of methane, and that's why people are so upset about beef, especially, and I guess dairy to a certain degree as well. But at least with dairy, you don't kill the cow. So with meat, you've got to keep on making more and more cows all the time to be killed. So you're breeding cows all the time, feeding them up to kill them for one use. So huge amount of environmental impact from that. How do you capture that methane? You can't like put a mask on them to capture it. Cows probably aren't going to like that. I don't know how you'd filter out the methane. Maybe someone will come up with a way of doing this. Maybe you could feed the cows something different where they don't make as much methane. There was a company found a way of doing that, Bovava or something like that. That might be a possibility to reduce the amount of methane they produce. But in general, that looks like a difficult option. So, we can think about what to do about that. Another difficult one, there's a few of these long distance air travel, right? Because, batteries have got a lot better, but they're not strong enough yet to take a big, heavy plane all the way across the Atlantic or the Pacific or anything like that with hundreds of people in it. So at the moment, there's no cheap alternative to jet fuel that's zero carbon or low carbon or anything like that. You've just got to burn loads of kerosene to get across those long distances. So that's very polluting, essentially. So long distance air travel, another really tough one. Long distance shipping, a little bit similar. Maybe there's more prospects for that, but the alternatives aren't cheap. That's just using marine fuels that are used at the moment. So maybe there are alternatives, but they're going to be more expensive to use. Let's think about the costs of net zero. Now think about yourself as an individual. You can work out your emissions. There's websites you can go on. You can work out what your CO2 emissions and CO2 equivalent emissions are per year. And so just to give you some context, for us in the UK, we are about 5 tons per person per year. And that will vary, right? So if you're someone who has a very environmentally friendly lifestyle, maybe you'll be closer to one or something like that. If you're someone who flies around a lot and that sort of thing, maybe you're closer to 20 or something, so this will vary. But obviously in the UK, we've got a lot of wind power, so our carbon emissions tend to be lower from the electricity that we use. In the USA, I believe it's around sort of 14 or 15 per person. So, but some people might be, up at 50 or something like that if they do a lot of flying, as I say, if they eat a lot of meat, all these kinds of things. And maybe if it's a small company, we could work it out like this for companies as well. Here are the costs at different prices for ton of carbon. So the social cost of carbon, the higher this is, the more obviously it's going to cost you if you're charged carbon tax based on your carbon pollution. So if it's cheap social cost of carbon, if it's $50, and obviously it's the same if it's pounds or euros or whatever, it's just you're just multiplying. So if it's £50, then that person who's got just 1 ton of emission a year, then their annual cost of this tax would be £50. If you've got that really high polluting person, theirs is going to be £2,500 a year. So maybe they're quite a rich person and they could afford to spend every year £2,500 for their carbon tax. But let's say, like I was saying, as time goes on, we use up the cheap options to reduce our carbon emissions, and then we start to have to do the more expensive things. And eventually, we run out of the really cheap stuff, and the eventual point, I think, is that we're going to have to suck the CO2 out of the air. That's where we're going to head. And how much is that going to cost? Well, at the moment, it's off the chart. And maybe it could come down to 1,000 tons. Some people might say it'll get less than that. Maybe it'll drop to 500. I don't see why it would, but maybe they know something I don't. But let's say it went up to $1,000 or whatever your currency is, a ton of CO2. If you're that 1 ton person, you're suddenly paying $1,000 a year for your carbon tax. If you're that average UK person, you've got 5 tons of CO2, you're going to have to pay £5,000 a year in tax just for the carbon, not including all your other taxes and everything like that. So that's quite a big difference. If you're that really sort of high emitting person, yours is going to go up from 2,500 to 50,000 a year. 50,000 a year you will pay to do your pollution. Now, obviously, as I've said, the cost is going up as time goes on. But what we can try and do is reduce where we are as time goes on. So if you're at this 50 point stage and it's $50 a ton, let's say you're in the States, what are your options here? Well, you might start to think, well, in that case, I will just change certain things about my lifestyle or about my infrastructure that I use or something like that. I'll get a heat pump, get an EV, whatever it is. I'll start to use cleaner electricity or something like that. You can then move yourself up the table, as it were, down in cost, depending how you look at the table. But yeah, you would go in this direction here so that as time goes on, although the price has gone up, it's gone up 10 times, let's say, from $50 to $500, but you're still paying the same because you've dropped your emissions from 50 tons a year down to 5 tons a year. So you've gone from that really high emitting position to more modest emissions. And then, even though the price of the carbon has gone up, your annual cost has stayed the same. So we're moving, along this way over time. The social cost of carbon is going to go up. That's the way we're going. And then, so what we all need to do to move ourselves from the more high levels of emission over time, move ourselves into the lower levels of emission. So we can move ourselves, you know, down on here. Maybe we can even, end up with a lower bill because we'll reduce our emissions so much. So there's this idea, the government is adding all these costs on with all this net zero stuff, but I just don't see it like that at all. Because what the government is doing, obviously, it's spending its money, it's subsidizing clean technology rollout, essentially, and it's spending money on that. And maybe that means, it does have less money for other things like health or education, unless it's just borrowing more. So it's like we're borrowing from future generations to help future generations. That might be the best we can do for them because we don't like to go without anything. And the other things it can do, it can regulate, right? So it's going to introduce efficiency standards and, introduce these, let's say mandates, and say, well, any new houses are going to have a heat pump in the future. They're going to have to be a certain level of energy efficiency or something like that. Fridges, freezers, whatever they are, they've got to be more and more energy efficient. And so why are they doing these things? They are doing it to save us money, right? Because if they start to charge us for our pollution, then we'll be polluting less. So this is the ultimate idea is that governments, they don't have, a 70, 80-year lifespan like we do as individuals. They can think longer term. That's the idea. Hopefully, they're doing this. They are thinking about longer term issues and threats and so on. And maybe people, as a rule, they just think they're myopic, as the word, it's short-sighted. Essentially, we're just thinking about our next meal or something like that. We're not thinking about these long-term issues, about the fact that the cost of carbon is going to go up. And some people think longer term than others, right? Some people save loads for the future in their retirement. Other people just live day to day. So there's a huge variety in terms of this myopia. And people who are very poor, you can understand why they are very concerned about, the next day, because that's a real struggle for them. But this is why you have governments taking that bigger picture and the longer term view. So, you might have this question, Can you afford net zero? And I think sometimes this is the wrong question, right? Because other questions might be, well, can you afford to do nothing? Can you afford to continue your lifestyle as it is and, either pass those costs on to the future generations or not be ready for when those charges get added on to your costs? So, and what's the government doing? It might seem like it's spending money on these things, but it's doing that to make it more affordable for you, right? So if the government supports all this kind of clean technology, the rollout of all of these things, then you've got clean electricity available to you, and then my carbon footprint is much lower just because the electricity comes from wind and not gas or coal or something like that. So my carbon footprint dropped, just because the UK government supported the wind industry at some point in the past. I didn't have to do anything. They did all that. It had a cost. The cost's coming down, obviously, all the time, thanks in part for the UK government and Denmark especially for investing so much in the early stages of the wind turbines when they weren't so good, when they were more expensive, and now they're much, much better, much more efficient, huge things which produce loads of energy because of those earlier subsidies. So that's the way that the government is making net zero more affordable for us with what it does. And people who say it's really expensive are just saying they don't want to pay any of the costs. They don't want to pay for their pollution. They don't want to do anything about it. They just want to pass all the costs on to people in the future and let them worry about it. And so anyone who thinks that's not acceptable, or anyone who just does the calculations and says, well, it's actually cheaper for people now to just do this easy thing than for people in the future to have to deal with the consequences of the climate change, it's just a great investment. So, can we afford net zero? Can you afford net zero? Well, can you afford not to do anything about this? Is the better question, I think. And so, yeah, we can and we should. So, yeah, thanks for listening to that. I look forward to any responses, any reactions, any thoughts about anything that I've missed would be much appreciated. So, yeah, thanks very much.